There is a sound you would have heard in 1909 that does not exist anywhere on Earth today. It started before sunrise and it did not stop until the rain came. It was the sound of 68 Bucyrus steam shovels working at the same time, in the same 8-mile valley, swinging 95-ton iron jaws into a mountain that did not want to move. The Culebra Cut, 9 miles long, 300 feet deep at the worst of it, carved out of the spine of the continent by men who did not get to choose whether they were there. The shovels burned coal. The locomotives burned coal. The dynamite they used to break the rock so the shovels could lift it filled the air with a yellow haze that the equatorial sun could not punch through. There were days you could not see the man working 20 feet from you. There were days the dust caked so thick on the workers' faces that the only way you could tell who was alive and who had been killed by a falling rock was whether the eyes still blinked. 68 steam shovels, each one weighing as much as the Statue of Liberty's interior frame. Each one operated by a single man in an open cab, his hands on 2 levers, his lungs full of coal smoke and silica dust, his ears ringing from the blast 100 yards down the cut. He could not hear the foreman. He could not hear the whistle. He could not hear the slide when it started above him. 2 of them did not hear it on October 4th, 1907. The wall of the Cucaracha Cut, 2 million cubic yards of soft clay that the engineers had measured and graphed and pronounced stable, broke loose without warning at 2:14 in the afternoon. It came down the slope in a single living mass, and it took the rail line, and it took 2 locomotives, and it buried 2 of the steam shovels and the men inside them. They never recovered the bodies. The clay shifted again the next day, and the day after that, and by the end of the month, the Cucaracha slide had moved more than 10 million cubic yards of earth back into the cut that had taken 18 months to dig out. 2 men were under all of it. Their names were in the company ledger, and then they were not in the company ledger, and the slide kept moving for 2 more years. And somewhere under the floor of the Panama Canal today, they are still there. This is one story. There were 5,609 of them. That is the official count from the American period, 1904 to 1914. The actual count is higher. Nobody knows by how much. The machine that cut the canal also cut the men who ran it. Before we are done, you will know exactly how and why every ship that has crossed between the Atlantic and the Pacific in the last 110 years has been passing over their graves. The French tried first. That is the part of the story that gets one line in a history textbook and then disappears, and it should not, because the French failure is the only reason the American success was possible. Ferdinand de Lesseps had built the Suez Canal. Suez was flat. Suez was sand. Suez did not have a mountain in the middle of it, and Suez did not have mosquitoes carrying 2 diseases that no one yet understood. In 1881, de Lesseps came to Panama with a French company, a fortune in private investment, and the absolute certainty that what had worked in Egypt would work here. By 1894, when the company collapsed in the largest financial scandal France had ever seen, 22,000 workers were dead. Most of them from yellow fever, most of them from malaria, the rest from accidents, from heat, from drowning, from the things that happen to men working in a jungle that wants them gone. The machines they left behind, when the Americans arrived in 1904, were rusting in the rainforest. French steam shovels, French locomotives, French dredges, all of them inadequate, all of them too small for the job, all of them sitting in vines and orchids while the bones of the men who had operated them dissolved in the wet ground a few miles away. The Americans bought the rights for $40 million. They began work in 1904 with a different idea. They were going to build a lock canal, not a sea level canal. They were going to use a dam to flood a river valley and create a lake that would carry ships across most of the distance. They were going to attack the mosquito before they attacked the mountain. And they were going to use machines that no one, French, British, German, anyone, had ever built before. It was the largest construction project in the history of the world up to that moment. It would remain so for 60 years. The man they put in charge in 1907 was an Army colonel named George Washington Goethals. He had no experience building canals. He had no experience in the tropics. He had been an instructor at West Point, and he had supervised lock construction on the Ohio River, and the President of the United States had decided that this was enough. It was, as it turned out, enough. But not because Goethals was a great engineer. He was not. He was a great administrator, and the Panama Canal in 1907 needed an administrator more than it needed an engineer. The engineering had been figured out. The men had not been figured out. There were 30,000 of them on the line, and they were dying at a rate the company could no longer afford to publish. If you have ever crossed a bridge or driven through a tunnel and never thought about who is buried under it, this channel is for you. We are going to keep digging up the machines history paved over and the men who paid for them. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There are still hundreds buried. We are getting to them. Picture the Bucyrus 95-ton steam shovel. Now stop picturing it. You are imagining something too small. The bucket alone held 5 cubic yards of earth. That is enough to fill a modern dump truck. The shovel could swing that bucket through 180 degrees in less than a minute. The boom was 60 feet long. The boiler stood 13 feet tall and burned 5 tons of coal a day. The whole machine moved on rails, its own private railroad, built and rebuilt every few hours by track gangs racing to keep ahead of the cut. There were 102 of them on the canal at peak. Most were Bucyrus, some were Marion. The crews called them by number: Shovel 232, Shovel 184, Shovel 125, which is in a museum in Panama today, the only survivor. Each shovel had a crew of 7. The engineer ran the boom in the bucket. The crane man operated the swing. The fireman fed the boiler. The 2 oilers crawled around the moving parts during the brief pauses, greasing bearings, checking joints. The water boy hauled water from a tank car for the boiler and for the men. The pit man, the lowest paid of all of them, stood in the bucket's path and broke up large rocks with a sledgehammer between scoops so the bucket would not jam. The pitman job killed the most men. The bucket weighed 3 tons, empty. It came down on a man who was a fraction of a second too slow, and there was nothing left to bury. The company kept records of pitman fatalities for the first 2 years and then stopped keeping records, and no one has ever recovered them. The shovel could lift 400 tons of earth in an hour. It could not lift it directly out of the cut. It dumped its load into railroad cars on a parallel track, and a tiny, tireless fleet of saddle tank locomotives, narrow gauge, all coal-fired, more than 500 of them, hauled the spoil out of the valley and dumped it where the engineers were trying to build a new continent. The Pacific entrance breakwater is made of Culebra-cut spoil. The Gatun Dam, 3 miles long, the largest earth dam in the world at the time, is made of Culebra-cut spoil. The Naus Island Causeway is made of Culebra-cut spoil. 232 million cubic yards of mountain was moved by these shovels in 10 years. Most of it had to be moved twice, because the slides kept bringing it back. The slides were the thing the engineers could not solve. The geology of Panama is volcanic clay layered over weathered shale. When you dig into it, the clay becomes a lubricant. When the rain comes, and the rain comes 9 months of the year, sometimes 6 inches in an afternoon, the lubricant becomes a slurry. The slurry moves, the mountain follows. In 1910, a single slide on the east bank of the cut moved 50 acres of earth 28 feet down. It buried 4 shovels. It killed 11 men instantly and 7 more in the rescue. It set the schedule back 6 weeks. The men called it the East Culebra Slide, and they meant it as a warning, but it was not the worst. The worst was Cucaracha. Cucaracha kept moving for the entire 10 years of the project and is still moving now, slowly, under the canal, the way a buried thing remembers what it used to be. There is a man you have probably never heard of, and you should have. His name was William Crawford Gorgas. He was a U.S. Army doctor, born in Mobile. Octa, Alabama, son of a Confederate general. And in 1900, he had figured out in Havana that yellow fever was carried by a mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, specifically, the one that breeds in standing water near human dwellings. When he got to Panama in 1904, the canal company laughed at him. Theodore Shantz, the chairman of the Isthmian Canal Commission, called Gorgas's mosquito theory balderdash to his face. Shantz believed yellow fever was caused by miasma, by bad air, by filth, the same theory that had killed the French. For 1 year, Shantz blocked Gorgas's funding. In that year, more than 4,000 men got yellow fever in the canal zone. Hundreds died. The body wagons came at dawn so the new arrivals would not see them. There was a place in Panama City the workers called the Hospital Hill, and it was where the convalescents went, and many of them did not come back. In 1905, Theodore Roosevelt finally fired Shantz and replaced him, and the new commission gave Gorgas everything he asked for. He asked for a great deal. Gorgas's program: every standing pool of water in the canal zone was to be drained, screened, or coated with kerosene. Every house was to be screened. Every cistern was to be sealed. Every hospital ward was to be netted. Every breeding pond, every cattle trough, every flooded gutter, every discarded tin can was to be inspected and treated. It was the largest sanitation campaign in human history up to that moment. 4,000 men working for Gorgas, sweeping over 500 square miles of jungle in straight-line grids, draining, screening, oiling. By 1906, they had broken the back of yellow fever in the zone. By 1907, there were no new cases. By the time the canal opened in 1914, there had not been a yellow fever death among the Americans in 8 years. Malaria was harder. Malaria was carried by a different mosquito, Anopheles. And that one did not breed in barrels and tin cans. It bred in slow water in the deep forest, miles from any house. You could not screen a swamp. So the Americans used quinine instead. Every worker was issued a daily ration. Some took it, most did not. The taste was bitter, the side effects were nausea, ringing ears, and a kind of dull headache that did not go away. Workers traded their quinine for tobacco. Workers threw their quinine in the latrines. Workers drank rum to chase the taste and then forgot to take the next dose. Malaria killed 4,500 American period workers, or thereabouts. The official count is lower because the company did not classify a death as malaria if the man died of something else first. Pneumonia, dysentery, exhaustion, a falling rock, even if the malaria had been working on him for months. Gorgas saved more lives on the Panama Canal than any engineer ever did. There is a hospital named after him in Panama City today. There is no statue. There is a part of this story that is worse than the dying. The Panama Canal Zone operated under a two-tier wage system that the Americans imported from the Jim Crow South. White workers, almost all American, were paid in gold. Black workers, almost all West Indian, mostly from Barbados, Jamaica, and Martinique, were paid in silver. The currencies were not equivalent. Like gold workers earned 3 to 4 times what silver workers earned for the same labor. The system extended beyond pay. Gold workers had screened housing, ice, hospital access, family quarters, schools for their children, 4 weeks of paid leave a year. Silver workers had open barracks, no screens, a separate hospital with 1/5 the staffing, no schools, no paid leave, no death benefits. Gold workers ate in commissaries. Silver workers ate from barrels of rice and salted fish that the company bought in bulk. Of the 30,000 men in the field at any given time, roughly 25,000 were silver. They did the dangerous work. They were the pitmen. They were the dynamite gangs. They were the shovel oilers and the track laying crews and the men who walked into the slides with picks to dig out the bodies of the men who had been there before them. When a silver worker was killed, the company paid no death benefit to his family. The body was buried in the Silver Cemetery in Mount Hope, where there were headstones at all, said only the man's first name and his employee number. By 1914, the Mount Hope Cemetery held more graves than any town in the Canal Zone had living residents. Most of those graves were silver. Most of those silver graves were unmarked. The exact number is unknown because the company did not require death certificates for silver workers, and many of the men buried there had been recruited under names that were not their own. All men who had crossed from Barbados on a 6-week labor contract and never gone home. There is a story that the engineers in the gold commissaries used to tell about the silver workers. They said that on payday in Ceylon, you could hear the silver men singing in the streets. The engineers thought it was a happy sound. It was not. It was a Caribbean tradition called tea meetings, wakes essentially. And the men were singing for their friends who had been killed that month and were never coming home. The engineers did not know that. The engineers did not ask. The locks were the part of the canal that no one had ever built before, and that the engineers did not know how to build until they tried. There are 3 sets. Gatun on the Atlantic side, with 3 chambers in series. Pedro Miguel on the Pacific side, 1 chamber. Miraflores on the Pacific side, 2 chambers. Each chamber is 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide, and 40 feet deep. Each lock gate is 65 feet tall, 7 feet thick, and weighs 730 tons. There are 46 gates. They were fabricated in Pittsburgh, shipped to Panama in sections by rail and steamship, and assembled on site. The men who assembled them worked inside the chambers, 50 feet below the surrounding ground, in concrete walls that were still curing and giving off heat. The temperature inside the chambers in July reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was total. The men worked in shifts of 2 hours on, 2 hours off, and a number of them died of heat stroke and were carried up the lock walls in canvas slings while the next shift went down. The gates moved on hinges. Each hinge was the largest single piece of forged steel ever produced up to that point. The forging was done at Bethlehem Steel. The shipping was done by the Panama Railroad. The lifting and installation was done by men with chain hoists and timber gantries, because cranes capable of lifting a 730-ton gate did not exist yet, and would not exist for another 30 years. When a gate was being installed and a chain hoist failed, which happened, you had perhaps 2 seconds to get out of the chamber. The men who survived those 2 seconds remembered the sound. A long groan from the iron, a snap from the chain, a moment when nothing moved. Then the gate fell. The concrete walls would shake for a minute afterward. The men who were caught, there were 9 of them across the 4 years of lock construction, that the company recorded were generally not recovered intact. The gates fell into water that was kept in the chambers to cushion the concrete during curing. The water was deep, and the gate, when it landed, displaced enough water to drown anyone who was still alive on the chamber floor. The lock gates work by gravity. The water that fills and empties the chambers, 52 million gallons per ship, is moved by hydraulic head. No pumps, no electricity. It comes from Gatun Lake by gravity, into the chambers through tunnels in the concrete, and it leaves by gravity into the next chamber down. The whole system is a mechanical clock the size of a city, run by water and silence, and it has not failed in the 110 years since it opened. Every part of it is a tomb. Here is something to think about before we get to the last act of this story. If you had been in Panama in 1909, silver paid, working a pitman shift, watching the man before you get crushed by a Bucyrus bucket because he was a half second too slow, would you have walked off the job and gotten on the next steamer back to Bridgetown? Or would you have stayed and taken his place because the 80 cents a day was more than your family had ever seen? Tell me in the comments. The men who walked off, you never heard of. The men who stayed, built the canal. Both of them made history. The mountain did not break with shovels. The mountain broke with dynamite. 61 million pounds of it, set off over 10 years, in roughly 2,000 individual blasts. The dynamite was made by the DuPont Company, packed into 8-inch sticks, and transported by rail to the cut every morning. It was placed in holes drilled by tripod-mounted steam drills, pneumatic drills called tripod drills, each one operated by a 3-man crew, each one able to drill a 40-foot hole in granite in about an hour. The holes were spaced in patterns the engineers calculated to fracture the rock in specific directions. The patterns worked mostly. When they did not work, they killed. A premature detonation in the Culebra Cut on December 12, 1908, killed 26 men in a single instant. The official explanation was that a worker drove a tamping rod too hard into a charged hole, generating friction heat that ignited the cap. There is a different explanation that the foreman on the line gave to anyone who would listen, that the dynamite had been left in the sun for hours before the shift began, and that the heat had degraded it past safe handling. The company did not want this explanation. It would have meant changing how the dynamite was stored, which would have meant slowing the work. After the December 1908 blast, the company changed nothing. There were 17 more premature blasts before the canal opened. Each killed between 3 and 20 men. The largest, in November 1910, killed 22. The smallest, the ones that took only 1 or 2 men at a time, were not always recorded. A Jamaican worker named Levi Roach was killed in a small premature blast in 1912, and his name appears in a Barbados-born co-worker's letter home, but does not appear in any company record. There is no grave for Levi Roach in Mount Hope, because there was nothing left of him to bury. The dynamite gangs were almost entirely silver. White workers operated the drills. Black workers loaded and tamped the charges. When the charge was set and the fuse was lit, the gangs ran. They had between 2 and 3 minutes, depending on the fuse length, before the blast. They ran along the rail lines because the rail bed was cleared and flat. They ran past the parked steam shovels with their boilers still hissing. They ran out of the cut and into the jungle on the far side, and they counted, and when the count was over, they listened for the blast. If the count was over and there was no blast, they had to go back in. Someone had to relight the fuse. Someone had to find out why the charge had not gone. That someone was usually the foreman. And the foreman was usually a man who had drawn the short straw, and the foreman was the one who died if the charge went late. The foreman had a name for this duty. They called it going to listen. A foreman who went to listen had a 1 in 8 chance of not coming back. 88 foremen went to listen between 1904 and 1914. 11 of them did not come back. Their names are on a brass plaque in the administration building in Balboa. The plaque is in a hallway most visitors never walk down. The first ship through the Panama Canal was the SS Ancon, a cement carrier owned by the Panama Railroad Company. It crossed on August 15, 1914. 10 years and 4 months after construction began. The world was not paying attention. World War I had started 2 weeks earlier. Front pages were full of Belgium and the Marne. The opening of the largest engineering project in human history was a small story, below the fold. The Ancon took 9 hours and 40 minutes to cross. It used 52 million gallons of water. It rose 85 feet at Gatun, traveled 23 miles across the lake, descended 31 feet at Pedro Miguel, descended another 54 feet through the two chambers at Miraflores, and emerged into the Pacific Ocean on the other side of a continent. George Washington Goethals was not on board. He was at his desk. He had said publicly that the ceremonial first crossing was for the politicians, and that he would prefer to keep working. The men who had built the canal, the silver men, the gold men, the foremen who had gone to listen, the pitmen and the dynamite gangs, and the water boys and the lockgate fitters, were not invited. Most of them were not in Panama anymore. The construction force was being demobilized. The ones who could not afford passage home were being given railroad tickets to Colon and a small cash settlement and a handshake. The dead were not invited either. The dead were in Mount Hope. By 1914, Mount Hope Cemetery held over 15,000 identified graves. Most were silver. The actual number of dead from the American Canal era is somewhere between 5,609, the official figure, and roughly 8,000, the figure historians have arrived at by adding back the cases the company classified out of the malaria column. The French figure, from 1881 to 1894, is 22,000. The combined toll for the Panama Canal, a 50-mile waterway, is somewhere around 30,000 human lives, 30,000 men, to make a passage between two oceans. The math, if you do it, comes out to about 600 lives per mile. Most of the steam shovels are gone. They were sold for scrap in the 1920s and 1930s. A few were preserved. Shovel 125 sits at the Panama Canal Museum at Miraflores. The others were melted down and became cars and cookware and bridge girders for projects that came later. The locks still work. The gates have been refurbished, but the original hinges are still there, the original concrete is still there, the original shape of the chambers is still there. Every ship that crosses the Panama Canal today crosses through the same machinery the silver men built between 1907 and 1914. The Culebra Cut, renamed the Gaillard Cut in 1915, is still moving. The slides have not stopped. The Panama Canal Authority dredges it constantly. There is a permanent fleet of dredges working the cut today, every day, removing the same clay that buried the steam shovels in 1907 and 1910 and 1913. The mountain is still trying to fill in the canal. The men, with diesel pumps now and not pickaxes, are still trying to keep it open. Mount Hope Cemetery is still there. The silver section is mostly unmarked. In recent years, historians from the University of the West Indies have begun trying to identify the men buried there by cross-referencing labor contracts in Bridgetown with company employment records in Panama, with the hope of giving names back to the headstones that have only first names and employee numbers. The work is slow, but the records are incomplete. Many of the men who died in Panama had been recruited under false names because they were running from something at home, a debt, a marriage, a charge. Their families never knew where they had gone. Their families do not know now. When you sail through the Panama Canal, and 40 ships a day do, 25,000 a year, carrying 6% of the world's seaborne trade, you pass over the unmarked graves of men whose families never learned their fates, and through the lock gates that men were crushed installing, and across a lake whose floor is the buried foundation of a railroad, on which thousands of men worked themselves into the ground. The canal is a miracle of engineering. That is true. It is also a cemetery 65 miles long. That is also true. And the engineering does not work without the cemetery. The two are not separable. You cannot have one without the other. There has never been a canal in human history that was built without bodies in its banks. There has only been a question, asked in 1881 by the French and asked again in 1904 by the Americans, of how many. The answer in Panama was 30,000. We know that now. We did not know it then. The men who knew it then did not say so out loud. They could not afford to. The work had to continue. The ships had to cross. They cross now. They cross every day. The canal works. The men who built it are mostly forgotten. Their names, where they exist at all, are on plaques in hallways that nobody walks down, in a country most of them were not from, on a strip of land most of the world will never see. They don't make canals like that anymore. Not because we couldn't, because we wouldn't. Because we now count the cost. In 1904, we did not count it. We just paid it.